greatest competition in life was not against others, but it was against myself. To reach down into myself and find that little extra that I didn't know I had. My point is that there are things that we say and there are things that we do in life, and we never know the impact that they may have. I think times when I'm in school and all the years I spent teaching, I was wasting my life. And yet there are times when you get feedback back from students, people in their adult life later, and find out you made all the difference in their lives and never knew it. You just got to gradually fight the gear to slow down. I don't know why they put a fixed gear on the thing. Well, I grew up in Speedway, Indiana. My childhood was one where I was not very confident in myself in any athletic sense. I didn't participate in any sports in high school. Never figured I was good enough. I was one of the younger kids in my class. I was being born at the end of September, and I was probably I pretty much stayed away from my peers. I was fascinated by collecting insects. I was crazy about birds. I had a lot of animals for pets. So I was sort of a strange bird in my own way relative to my peers. I really had no interest in competitive cycling. I came here to Indiana University, and I'd heard about the thing called the Little 500, but I didn't think much about it. And I thought of myself as being this little skinny shrimp that would be humiliated on the beach by the big muscle man who'd kick sand in his face in front of a lovely girl sitting on the beach. In the dorm, I lived in Rollins House at that time as a freshman, and the athletic chairman of the dorm was Gene Schreiber, and he was a senior, and he did a lot of work on weights, and he was about 6'3" or so, and taller than I and much more muscular than I. And I thought, this is a guy that probably has I kept seeing, when I see him, I think this guy will probably be humiliating me or making fun of me or ridiculing me or something. And he wasn't that way at all. He was very kind and soft-spoken. And so anyway, in the spring of 1958, I guess it would have been, he comes to me and wants me to try out for a little 500 team. And I thought, what do you mean? I couldn't do that. He says, well, he says, you don't have small legs. He says, I think you could ride him. Oh, I said, I've never done anything like, I couldn't do that. He says, oh, come on. He says, I don't want to be the first athletic chairman of our dorm that couldn't field a team. And he says, I don't know where I'm going to find 3 other riders. And in the kind of way I thought, well, he's the guy that probably had every reason to humiliate me, and yet he's been very kind to me and he's in a bind, and maybe I should try to help him, and yet I really don't think I could do this. So he says, well, would you at least come out and try to ride with us one day on a training ride? So to get him off my back, I said, okay. So the next day came, and when the time came to go riding with him, I went off and stayed in the toilet stall in the dormitory. I sat there about 20 minutes or so and figured the coast was clear. And sure enough, they'd gone riding, and I missed out on it, and I was thankful. But he saw me that evening in the cafeteria, and he said, hey, we missed you today. I said, I got out of class late. Anyway, I realized I couldn't keep avoiding this for the rest of my life. And so I went riding with them the next day, expecting to be humiliated. But I was flying away from them on the hills, and they couldn't keep up with me, and I was just trying to keep from being embarrassed. And I looked at myself and thought to myself, this is the first time in my life when I should ask myself, what could I do if I actually try at something? I think cycling really endeared me because of the suffering involved And I felt that I was such a miserable being that I deserved to have to suffer. That was my way of justifying my existence. But the strange thing was that through all of that, I grew in self-respect that I had not known before. In my freshman year, even though I spent many hours studying, my grades were not all that reflective of doing that much studying, and yet I had studied a lot. And I came to realize that the focus that I had been thinking about when I was studying was I was sitting there about how much I hated myself and how much I could be like others and all that. And then when I took up cycling and went through the things that I did, I came to peace within myself. And you know, and later when I really was training a lot and didn't spend nearly the amount of time studying that I had when I was a freshman, my grades went up because I'd found peace within myself. And I credit a lot of this to Carl Napper, who was a Phi Psi, who discovered me when I was a sophomore down here riding my old clunker bicycle on High Street. And he comes up to me and he says, "Hey, you're moving along pretty well." And he was riding some light speed, 10-speed bike that he had picked up from a professional bike racer. And Carl was sort of like a bicycle evangelist. He was so excited to find somebody that he thought he could convert to wanting to race bikes. And so to me, it was like God on wheels had discovered me. And so he got me riding with him and riding with some of the riders in the Phi Psi house, even though I was riding that year in the little 500 for Rollins' house. When I pledged the house at the end of the 59 race, the little 500, I was eliminated from riding the following year because I changed housing units. The Student Foundation passed a rule that said, if you change housing units, you lose a year of eligibility. And so I was ineligible to ride in 1960, which would have been my junior year. So then when the race came around in 1961, I was ineligible that year because they came out with a rule that said if you've ever ridden in other races that we hadn't given you permission to do, you're ineligible. And of course they knew that I had by then, because I'd ridden in the Elgin Chicago road race, the Pan American trials, and a few other races, and placed in some of those. And of course, with Carl Napper helping me along the way. But anyway, that made me ineligible to ride as a senior. And I left school with 1 semester to go. And I went up and worked in the medical center research lab in Riley Hospital. I worked with in the cardiac research lab and took some courses at the University Extension there to keep up with my schoolwork. And in my absence, they removed that rule. So I returned to campus in 1962 to finish up my college education. I was eligible to ride that year, and that year they had picked up Steve Tesich, who was a freshman, who had shown up on campus with a 10-speed bike. Now, back then, a 10-speed bike was virtually unheard of around here. I don't think Schwinn had even come out with the Schwinn Continental yet. And he had picked up the bike at a bike shop in Chicago. So that's why he happened to have one. And they had, of course, 10 speeds up there and in competitive bike shops and so forth. And so when the brothers in the house saw a guy on campus with a 10-speed bike, they figured he must be a serious rider. So they started rushing him to pledge the house. Well, the truth was he had come down here on a wrestling scholarship, and he had just bought the bike to get around campus on. Well, when I would come down on weekends, they'd tell me about, oh, we got this European bike rider that we're trying to get in the house. So they're telling me about him, and they would tell him about me, and I'm coming back, and I'm this great rider and all that. Meanwhile, I come down here one weekend, and I'm riding my bike, and there's someone on a bike up the road ahead of me, and I catch him, and I'm singing an aria from, I think, from Rigoletto or something. And I'm riding past him, and it turns out we meet. I'm talking to him, and it's Steve Tesich. And I'm this Dave Blase he's heard about. So he pledges the house, and he becomes my fraternity son. And we ride together in the race there.
Steve Tesich has written such movies as, of course, Breaking Away, and recently completed the screenplay for Garp, and Eyewitness, and his current motion picture, Four Friends, is quite popular all across the United States. Originally from Yugoslavia, he's here with us tonight, and he spent part of his life, as you probably know, in Indiana. Please now a nice welcome for Steve Tesich.
And in any case, to cut to the chase here, we ended up riding with two other guys, a friend of mine and a couple, well, they were two other friends, one who was doing student teaching in South Bend, who had been on a previous winning team, and another rider who hadn't ridden in the race before, but showed an interest to want to ride. And that was our team that year, which was sort of thrown together at the last minute. And so I had prepared myself in training to ride the whole race if I had to in order to win. And we did win. And it sort of revolutionized the race because it demonstrated that you could win the race by riding long series of laps. Whereas prior to that, the race was pretty much a case where teams would ride 3 or 4, 5, 6 laps in exchange. And so everybody was hopping on and off the bike all the time, trying to catch up, and things got all spread out really quick in the race. And people were scattered all over the track. But when I went out and rode long series of laps and won the race, it demonstrated a whole new technique of racing. And in fact, it really, I think, saved the race because it made it a lot more competitive, and it meant that teams that were prepared and had trained so they could ride longer series of laps, a pack would form, you could sit in the pack, and you could be there at the end of the race and be competitive for the final sprint. And so it made the race a lot more competitive than it had been in the past.
I mentioned, as people now know, that you lived for a time in Indiana, and maybe they don't know that. I knew that because I lived there, I guess, around the same time you were there.
Two Hoosiers.
Yeah, but that was, of course, the setting for Breaking Away.
That was my college years, and I ran into a guy who was doing his Italian fantasy. I was riding a bike. I hear an Italian opera being sung behind me. I turn around, there's this guy climbing a hill singing. Starts talking Italian to me, and being Yugoslavian, knowing how tough it is on foreigners, I really have pity on the guy. Mm-hmm. For a week, I try to tell him what America is like, what it's like to be in Indiana, and all this. And then I find out he was born in Indianapolis, grew up there, and this whole fantasy thing, it was just a kind of a daydream.
One day I get a phone call from Steve. He's down here in Bloomington. He says, Blaser, he says, we're making a movie down here. He says, we want you to come down here. We want to use your name as the main character in the movie. He says, you need to come down here and sign some papers, and also we can get this done. And so I went down, and I get down there, and then no one says anything about it, except they want me to be in the road race part of the movie. And so I did do that, but I found out later that when they went to get me cleared to be the main character in the movie, my name, the legal department of the 20th Century said, no, wait a minute, is this biographical? Well, no. Well, you cannot use a real person's name knowingly in a movie if it's not biographical. So then they said, okay, we'll use Dave for the first name, and we'll use Stoller for the second name. Stoller was our manager. Bob Stoller was the manager of our team in 1962. So they took his last name and my first name, and that became the character in the movie.
Quanto sarà il prossimo
I think the greatest happiness in my life is to be able to see that I may be able to relieve the pain and suffering of others, or into some way contribute in some way that contributes to their happiness. The crazy thing is that the more you try to hold on to things for yourself, the faster it goes away. The only way that you can grow is to sacrifice of yourself.